Hello and welcome to today's PIR live event brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacey Joyce and I will be your host. Remember that you can ask questions anytime by clicking the chat button in the top left. Make sure you tell us your name, your school, or your city so that we can give you a shout out when we ask your question. Today's guests are Dr. Michael Wesner. He is an associate professor, a psychological science director, and in the Department of Psychology, and Dana Dupuis, who is a Ph.D. candidate in the Clinical Psychology program, both from Lakehead University. Thanks so much for joining us today. I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you. So I'll do the share screen. And so hopefully it's up now.
It is, you're good.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for listening in. What I thought I would do is give a brief overview of an area of science called neuroscience and just talk about some of the many different areas in neuroscience before opening up for questions about any specifics you might have about things related to neuroscience. And my hope is after I talk about this, you'll get an appreciation of how much variety there is in terms of the areas of research interest and clinical interest falls under the heading of neuroscience. So I'll just to give a little bit of an advertisement here, I'm chair of an organization here at Lakehead called Neuroscience Research Interest Group, and it's also called NEURIG, and you see that up in the upper left corner. And part of this talk I'm introducing to you is from a series of talks that we present all year long with NEURIG. We have different invited speakers, and I thought I'd take some of the slides from an earlier talk I did for NEURIG to discuss what neuroscience actually is. But I'll have some information at the end as to how you could possibly connect up with NEURIG and other sites that are relevant to neuroscience. First of all, I just want to say most people think of neuroscience as something that has to do with the brain. It's an area that studies the brain. And I have here two slides that show a brain image over here to the left, and then over here to the right is actually a little cute way of deciding how big your brain actually is in your head. It's take your two fists, put them together, and that's about the size of your brain. So it's not actually all that big, even though a lot of people talk about it. But it's very complex, and hopefully after I talk a little bit more, you'll get a sense of the complexity of this two-fisted organ that resides inside your head. Now, having said that neuroscience studies the brain, that is partly true, but it's not completely true. Neuroscience studies more than just the brain. It studies essentially the nervous system. Now, the nervous system entails the brain, it covers the brain, and you see this here in this slide. I have brain as part of the nervous system, and over here, just for comparison's sake, you see there's different brain structures representing different species, including the human over here on the left, upper left, but you see the bear, a macaque, which is a monkey, a baboon, and a chimpanzee, and you can see the sizes of the brain varies. But in addition to the brain, it also includes the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is connected to the brain, and the spinal cord is going to be involved with sending messages in and out from signals arriving from the brain, as well as information coming inbound to be processed by the brain. And together, both of these structures, both the brain and the spinal cord, makes up what's called the central nervous system. So neuroscience definitely studies the brain, but it also studies the spinal cord, and collectively, together, that's the central nervous system, which is sometimes referred to as the CNS. But that's not the whole story, because I said nervous system. And to include the nervous system, that also means it's the brain, the spinal cord, as well as parts of the what's called the peripheral nervous system. These are the nerves that are found outside of the spinal cord that activate and instigate operations or activate operations outside of the spinal cord. And there's actually two parts to that. There's something called the somatic nervous system, which is the body nervous system. This is the thing that we talk about when we talk about if we want to make a movement or if we want to sense something on our bodies like touch or tickle. That's the somatic nervous system, and that includes what's called afferent and efferent nerves. Afferent equal to sensory inbound signals, and efferent being equivalent to motor or outbound signals. So signals going out of the spinal cord of the central nervous system to the periphery. If it's motor, it's an efferent nerve that's going to activate muscle. If it's afferent, it's inbound signals going back into the brain. Afferent can also be not just from a touch perception, touch sensation, but it could also involve things like audition, which is hearing, and vision. So all those are combined to be considered sensory information coming in. So that's the somatic, and then there's another division, which you might have heard about, part of the autonomic, meaning automatic. It also has an afferent set of nerves and an efferent set of nerves. So these two nerve sets are still found with the automatic nervous system. But the one you may have heard about is the one that deals with the motor side of automatic, and that's your parasympathetic and sympathetic. And generally when people are first introduced to the peripheral nervous system, they're introduced immediately to the sympathetic, which is the nervous system that responds to stress or fearful things, and the parasympathetic, which deals with maintaining housekeeping roles and challenges, housekeeping balance, I should say. There's more to it than that, but this, in a nutshell, is the nervous system. So if you're dealing with neuroscience, you're dealing with the brain, with the spinal cord, part of the CNS, but you're also dealing with, you can be dealing with connections of those systems to peripheral nervous systems, including the body somatic nervous system, as well as the autonomic nervous system, including the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So altogether, you're studying a bunch of nerves that are involved with these operations of communicating, both within the CNS and outside of the CNS in the periphery. So it's a complicated system. The nervous system is indeed very complicated, and it's evidenced by the fact that there's many nerve cells, or what's called neurons, that form circuits to create impulses that go across many parts of the body. So it's a very, what's called integrative, connected to many different parts of the body, and that includes parts that are associated with things like psychological function. Psychological function meaning mental states, and also dealing with situations that has to do with behavior. This slide right here is actually a way of imaging, connecting circuits, and it's a fairly new imaging technique called diffusion tensor imaging that actually shows how interconnected these nerve cells are, in this case, in just the brain. The brain, by the way, contains something like 86 billion nerve cells, so it's quite extensive, and that's just the brain. That doesn't even cover the nerve cells that are found in the spinal cord, as well as those found in the periphery outside of the central nervous system. So having said that, when we talk about psychological function, because I think some of the things that may be asked about is related to some clinical issues in psychological functioning. When I talk about psychological functioning as a part of the body that certainly involves nerve cells and the nervous system, are things like perceptions, which are interpretations of what our senses are conveying from our peripheral parts of our body. Cognitions, which actually means to know or understand something. It also deals with how we remember events that happened in the past, how we recall things that have happened in the past. And also voluntary motor planning in terms of how we want to actually move our bodies in response to our environment. That actually requires some psychological manipulation or psychological processing to say, okay, now I want to make a voluntary movement to deal with my environment and what's happening in my environment. So in a nutshell, the psychological aspects of neuroscience deals with things like the stimuli coming in, the perception or understanding, interpretation of those stimuli, the cognitions in terms of what those stimuli are actually all about, and then the consequential motor planning that's needed to behave in relation to what's happening on the stimulus side. So collectively then, the brain actually encompasses those boxes that are part of perception, cognition, and voluntary movement. And neuroscience looks at these different aspects of how we adapt and process our information in our very changing environment. So what is neuroscience? It's actually, because of the complexity, it deals with many different areas of science. In a nutshell, it explores how all organisms, and that includes humans as well as other animals, function in our environment. The environment's always changing, and we need to adapt to that environment. Therefore, neuroscience combines many different areas of study, many different disciplines, including biology, medicine, chemistry, psychology, physics, mathematics, and engineering. And another way of saying that is that neuroscience is multidisciplinary, and it puts those things together to try to understand the nervous system. So this slide is just showing you the integrative aspect of neuroscience and how it pulls in all this information from different areas and different fields. So the best way to talk about neuroscience is to reduce it down to 5 research perspectives or levels of how we can understand this very complex organ and its system, the nervous system. We start with the molecular, which is microscopic. This is a way of studying different aspects of the nerve cells themselves, and what you're seeing over here is actually a depiction, a diagram of something called a protein system that deals with how nerves communicate with one another. Because it's so tiny, it's microscopic, this is actually looking at structures, molecular structures of this protein that's important for nerve communication. That would be put under the heading of molecular neuroscience. Then stepping up from that, we might want to look at how all those molecules together work in a cell environment, the nerve cell itself. What you're seeing here is an image of an actual nerve cell with a recording of its electrical activity traced underneath. This red cell is actually communicating with this green. Now these things aren't red and green, they're just highlighted that way to show you that you're looking at cell structure and how to relate that cell structure to how the nervous system operates. The next step up is to look at how all the cells collectively come together, forming circuits. That's systems neuroscience. And what you're seeing here is an example of somebody who's interested, let's say, in looking at pathways or circuits that are involved with things like face expression or facial recognition, how it is that you're able to identify a face that may be your mother's versus a face that's your father, or somebody that you may be familiar with. There's actual pathways, circuits of a bunch of nerve cells communicating with one another that's responsible for the functioning related to facial recognition and also how we recognize faces in terms of their emotional state. How do we recognize somebody who's angry versus somebody who's happy? That gets into systems neuroscience. There's also behavioral neuroscience, which looks at the expression of somebody in relation to their environment. These are actual behaviors now, but we may want to look at how things tie in relation to that facial, to that behavioral expression, how somebody behaves in their situation. And this is just an example of somebody who's studying behavioral neuroscience might want to look at imaging. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, for example, is what you're seeing here, which is a way of slicing the brain at different parts and actually identifying different areas of the brain that are active in relation to some kind of task that's being put onto a subject that's being measured, that's being imaged. These people are alive, they're functioning, and what the magnetic resonance imaging is doing is seeing the location of the areas of the brain associated with that particular task that the individual has to do. And then finally, as some people would consider this as a part of behavioral, but other people would treat it as a separate fifth research level, cognitive neuroscience. And this one you may have heard about in the news media because it's very popular. Michael Gazzaniga is the guy holding the brain there, and he actually coined the term cognitive neuroscience, and it deals with higher mental functioning. It deals with things like executive functioning, language, memory, a lot of intelligence, a lot of things that have to do with high-end, complex behavioral characteristics. And a lot of the cognitive neuroscience studies have developed within the last 20 years because of the ability to image brain in relation to different high-end task functioning. So it's a very exciting area because you're putting things together now and coming up with a way of looking at neural properties, nervous system properties as it relates to things like depression or language acquisition or something of that sort. Finally, I just drew here some of the areas. I won't go through all of them specifically, but it gives you a sense that neuroscience is very integrated. It deals with a lot of different research areas. And I just have it outlined here, some of the areas that may be considered molecular, like biophysics or neurochemistry, cellular, like genes and genomics, how you do gene cloning operations to get at nervous system operations, how they work, sensory processing, and neuropharmacology, drugs, and how the drugs influence the nervous system. Systems gets into things like sensation and perception, visual pathways, auditory pathways, touch pathways. All these things deal with systems approach as well as things I talked about. If you're dealing something with growth and development, that could be a systems approach. If you're doing something like neurocomputation or bioengineering, developing an artificial leg or an arm, and you may want to develop a robotics system that simulates the body, that gets into systems neuroscience as well. Then you have behavioral neuroscience, like I talked about, behavioral genetics, perception, linguistics, and speech. That also includes something called plasticity, which is the brain being plastic and allowing us to learn new information and remember new information. And then finally, the cognitive level, memory and cognition again, clinical neuropsychology. This deals with the clinical approach to understanding pattern problems, behavioral problems that may be clinically relevant. Things like social neuroscience, how people interact with one another from a social context and how that impacts the brain and the operations, as well as something called biological psychiatry, which looks again at problematic disorders from a biological perspective, but also looks at the symptoms, the behavioral symptoms that are characteristic of those disorders. That would be psychiatry, or more specifically, biological psychiatry. So I hope this gives you a sense of the different areas you can look at in terms of neuroscience and how extensive it is. As long as you have an interest in the brain and nervous system functioning, no matter what perspective you have, you're going to be lumped under the neuroscience heading as somebody who really wants to get a handle on how it is we behave, how it is we operate, how it is we sense our environment, and how it is that we cognitively interpret our environment. And it also gets to problems that could arise from these different systems that may be malfunctioning or not working properly. So the neuroscience, because of its collective integrative way of studying the nervous system, is, I think, the future in many areas of research, and it's an exploding field growing in many different perspectives, molecular to cognitive. And one of the questions that really comes up, and many people talk about this on a philosophical point of view, is can the human brain actually comprehend this complex structure called the human brain? And I think the answer is yes, if we actually appreciate all the different perspectives and understand all the different perspectives in an integrative sort of way, how this very complex system, including the brain, operates. And the thing I'm showing you here is something that's fairly new in development in terms of research. This is an animal model system that's being used, technical system called optogenetics, where they actually clone genes in the brain that are responsive to different light colors, more specifically wavelengths. And changing the color of these LEDs while it's implanted in the brain can actually alter different circuits that have this cloning operation done to them, so that the animal will behave differently based on the color of that LED. So it's a way of looking at these circuits and without having to do a lot of surgery or things that are very, what's called invasive. And that's optogenetics. So that's really my nutshell in neuroscience. I hope that made some sense. And again, if you're interested in some of this stuff, there are some websites you can go into, at least here at Lakehead, dealing with associated with NEURA, this multidisciplinary group of researchers. And if you get to the website, you'll see other links too, like things like conferences that deal with neuroscience, scientific neuroscience, areas of where people meet, other technology advances that have happened, and things of this sort that has a relationship to neuroscience in general. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I think it's very easy for myself, the general public, to think neuroscience, so that's the brain. And very clearly, there's a lot more to it. And even within the brain, there are so many areas you highlighted that if that's where someone wanted to focus their research, you can do it in any number of ways. I think before I get to questions, what I think would be valuable maybe is to have Dana just explain perhaps your different perspective in a couple of minutes, what it is that you do, so students might know what they can ask you.
Hi everybody, I'm Dana. So I am a fourth year PhD clinical psychology student or candidate, working towards getting my PhD in clinical psychology. I've been at Lakehead for a number of years. I do some research with Dr. Wesner and elsewhere in the department as well, the psychology department. So my degree program is based on kind of a mixture of doing research and then doing clinical work as well. So I'm here in case anybody has any questions about clinical psychology. So for clinical psychology, we do a lot of different things. There's a lot of different areas. I won't go into them. But for example, we might do assessments or testing on patients to see what's kind of going on with them, what kind of problems they might be experiencing, what types of mental health disorders they might need a diagnosis for. And then we also do treatment. So usually that's for me, something like cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on sort of the thinking styles and the behavioral aspects of different mental health disorders. So we kind of investigate some of those things and then use that information to make a treatment plan for different types of patients. So I work with a lot of different types of patients, folks with depression, PTSD, anxiety disorders. I've done work with children, families, adults, older adults, people with different types of cognitive disorders, such as primarily dementia is who I've worked with, patients with dementia. And then, yeah, I've done some work with individuals who have different psychotic disorders as well, like schizophrenia. So if you guys have any questions for me on the clinical side of things, I would be absolutely happy to do my best to address your questions. Hope
That's great. And then, yeah, I guess that was a question from me for you. So I think in honor of World Health Day today and the theme for 2017 being depression, let's talk, I'm going to begin with a question for Dana from Sharda at Morningstar Middle School in Mississauga, Ontario. She sort of has a two-part question here, so I'll ask you both parts, but actually, if I could get you to click the stop share button, we'll be able to see you a little bit better there. So that's great, thank you. Sharda would like to know, how do people living in third world countries who don't have access to health care or lack the amount of money needed for treatment for depression cope with it? And also, in a developed nation like Canada, where we do have access to healthcare, why do we neglect the fact that we need help when we're so privileged to have doors open for help?
That is a very good question, Sharda. Thank you so much. Could you repeat the first part for me? I'll try to answer that first.
Absolutely. So the first part dealing with how do people cope when they don't have access to that healthcare? And also, why do we sort of neglect to utilize that in a developed nation like Canada when we need it?
Yeah. So in terms of people coping when they don't have access to healthcare, that's actually a big problem going on around the world, and also even within Canada in many different places, like some of the northern remote reservations where it's harder to get access to healthcare in some of those communities because they're so far north. It's tough. People end up having to rely on things like social supports, which would be support from your family, friends, etc. Or, you know, they might have to travel somewhere where they do get access to healthcare. That said, there are some really great programs for what we call telehealth, where we can do psychotherapy, which is what we call the type of therapy that psychologists do. We can do psychotherapy sort of similar to this situation here, but over a video camera. And I've had some experience doing that type of psychotherapy with some of the folks from up north in the sort of more remote reservation areas. In terms of third world countries, some of them would also have access to something like telehealth. But what's important to remember as well is that sometimes with different cultures and different societies around the world, they might have a completely different conceptualization or idea of what mental health is and what things are actually problems. So here, something like depression, or even I think a good example is a psychotic disorder might be a big problem in North America and Western society. But in lots of different other cultures around the world, you might get a community member with a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, who's actually viewed as almost godlike in the community. So it's a part of it is a big difference on how mental health disorders are viewed within different societies. I can't remember what the second part is now that I've been random.
Absolutely. The second part was about why people fail to seek help if they need it when it's so readily available as in Canada.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different barriers to accessing help for mental health disorders. I would say that one of the biggest reasons that people don't seek help when they might need it is surrounding something called stigma. I don't know if you guys have heard of stigma before, but basically it's the idea that if, say, for example, I go in to get treatment for depression, I might be viewed in a certain way, perhaps a negative way, by my friends, my family, my community, and it's a really unfortunate idea, this sort of stigma. We actually have some researchers in the psychology department at Lakehead doing research on stigma and how it creates a huge barrier to people getting access to seeking mental health help. And a lot of it stems from a misunderstanding of you know, what a mental health disorder is and what it involves, and what kinds of treatment are available.
If I may just step in, because this has bearing in terms of what I just talked about. Part of the problem is people, even people in political positions, think that mental disease is different and has a different source than body disease, you know, physical disease. And the bottom line is, and this is what the neuroscience area focuses on, is actually it doesn't matter whether it's a mental disorder or a physical disorder like cardiovascular problems. It is a disorder that has a bearing on the organic, the fact that we have these nervous systems that can go awry. And to have the stigma that Dana was talking about is based on this idea that somehow mental disorders is another class of problem. And it's not. It's all part of the body. It just happens to involve the brain and the spinal cord, the whole nervous system that I talked about, which is why studies in neuroscience are very important. So everybody gets the idea that this is not a unique disorder when you have mental problems. This is something that can be tied to the organic structures of the brain and spinal cord.
I think that's a really important message. Absolutely. And I'm glad that we had that question. Thank you, Sharda, and that we had this discussion on today, especially because I think that's the point of this theme this year for World Health Day. But I do, I want to get to a few other questions that have been pouring in as we go here. We'll probably extend a few minutes here after our time that's scheduled, just so we can get to a couple extra questions. We have a question from the grade 12 class at Northview Heights in Toronto, Ontario, asking what are hallucinations? So I'm interpreting this as sort of what is going on from the neuroscientist perspective.
Well, it depends on the type of hallucination. And by the way, that can be a clinical symptom that can be used to diagnose a lot of different things, including types of schizophrenia, hallucinogenic schizophrenia. But in a nutshell, what's going on is oftentimes, I mean, from my neuroscience perspective, you're looking at pathways, like if it's a visual hallucination, that are active and not being controlled adequately enough, so that the brain compiles all this integrative information from all these active circuits that may not supposed to be active, but are active because for some reason they're not being highly regulated like they're supposed to be. And the end result is the individual misperceives the environment based on all this activity that's not being adequately controlled. So it might be due to something like over-excitability of certain pathways, or it might be due to the fact that certain inhibitions, these are circuits that are designed to control and inhibit excessive activity, aren't operating properly. And the net result is the brain is having a difficult time differentiating or distinguishing what is being developed from actual sense organs like the eyes or the ears and what is actually happening inside the brain itself. And thus, if you're misperceiving the events in your brain as something real, that's a hallucination. That's something that doesn't really exist, but is existing in your own neural circuits. So obviously, if you're if you have a disorder, this can be elicited through problems with different circuits, but it could also obviously be instigated through drugs, recreational drugs and the like, and that can lead to problems because you're activating circuits or not inhibiting proper circuits, so you come up with these hallucinatory images that aren't really there. But the brain thinks it's there because they're active. The pathways
right. Okay, and next we're going to a question from the grade 12 biology class at Sir Wilfrid Laurier Collegiate Institute. They have a question about visualizing memories. How are visual memories recalled?
Wow. I'm going to let you address that.
How are visual memories recalled? I think that's a good question, and I don't know if there's any really firm answer with respect to how you retrieve that information to come up with the conclusion that you're experiencing a visual recall. It's probably based on retrieval and how the system's going to retrieve the information that has been stored in certain circuits that are active. And what happens with memory is you get a lot of circuits that through repetition will strengthen, and that strengthening of the circuits will actually hold the events in place over time. But eventually, when you're recalling something, you have to pull that information back into a conscious level to be able to operate on it. So if there's I forgot what the question was, but if there's visual memories, I would assume that you would have to be pulling in information that's sourced out of some early onset of visual pathways that have been excessively used, and you're retaining that information through those sensory modalities, through the sensory system that's visual. And when you recall it, there is a recall to that fact. But as far as the actual properties that are associated with the recall, I'm not familiar with anything that's really firmed up in terms of how those specific operations will allow for something like a recall of a visual event versus, say, a recall of a tune that you may have heard, or the recall of some kind of touch experience that you may have had years down the road. Whenever you're recalling something, you're retrieving information from a well-used path that's been reinforced with rehearsal. How you retrieve that, it's an open question, an area that is being studied. And for me personally, I don't have a clear-cut answer for how, other than these comments that I made. Right. I don't know if that's helped or not. Do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think
no. So I just wanted to clarify, because these are students who are going through their cycles of learning and testing, and you mentioned these memory or these recall pathways being strengthened by rehearsal. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, there's actually a lot of studies that have been done. The whole area is called plasticity now. When you hear about neuroplasticity or plasticity of the brain, what that means is the brain itself, what used to be thought of as you developed a brain and then it was kind of locked in stone, it didn't change. Well, now researchers are coming to realize that even from the molecular, a lot of this came from the molecular level initially, that there's actually protein molecules and other things in the nerve cells that are malleable. They can change. They can adapt to different experiences. And part of that adaptation can be related to memory in the sense that through the way nerve cells communicate is through a synapse. That's a contact point that deals with neurochemistry, the neurotransmitters across the synapse. Based on the level of frequency or activity that crosses that synapse, through these molecular protein systems and other things at the cellular level, can strengthen. And when you have repeated information traveling across the same synapses, those synapses will actually become stronger, and they'll be able to communicate with each other better in a much more effective manner. And the idea is that strengthening of synapses through rehearsal, through processing information, repeating it and activating those same circuits, when you have a situation that calls upon events that are associated with those same strengthened circuits, it'll be much easier to retrieve it and use it in an area called working memory. So the synapse itself gets strengthened, and there's been some very elegant studies that have looked at how that plastic neural system changes with things like rehearsal or other things that need to be adapted to, that at one time, not that long ago, was thought impossible. So neuroplasticity is a very hot topic, and what's very interesting, if I just expand a little bit, is that it used to be reserved for one particular area of the brain that's called the hippocampus. It's just the name of the part of the brain that was very plastic. But now the researchers are realizing that plasticity, this idea of changes to the environment, can happen all throughout the brain and the spinal cord. And the reason that's interesting is because what happens when you have spinal injuries, you can be paralyzed. But if you can tap into those systems that are plastic, maybe we can come up with a rehabilitation system, rehabilitation procedure that will allow plasticity even in the spinal cord, and we may get rid of things like paralysis through damage. So it's a very exciting field.
Very interesting. I do want to get to a couple questions on heredity that we have here. So we've got students at Birchmount Park who would like to know if something like depression can be hereditary, and if so, how does it differ from something that may be developed due to someone's environment?
Something like depression, I would argue that all mental health disorders would have some hereditary component to them, but the development of an actual mental health disorder is also always going to depend on your environment. So it's always both. It's never one or the other. Some mental health disorders, particularly schizophrenia, there's been some research on bipolar disorder as well, which is a type of mood disorder that involves depressed mood. Our schizophrenia and bipolar disorder would be particularly influenced by heredity. But that said, you're always going to have some sort of environmental influence through your experiences in your day-to-day life in order, we call something, or there's something we call the stress diathesis model. If you picture a cup, do you have a cup? A bottle of water. So here's a bottle of water. And let's argue that at the top of your bottle of water is whatever mental health disorder you want to think of. Let's consider depression, right? So if you have this much genetic predisposition for developing depression eventually, then you would have to have this much in terms of your environmental experiences. If you have less of a genetic predisposition, you'd have to have more environmental experiences in your day-to-day life in order to put you at the level of developing depression, if that makes sense. I use that model sometimes with my patients, but it really just depends on the individual. And if you, let's say, have zero genetic predisposition or close to zero for developing depression, or zero or close to zero hereditary influence, then you'd have to have a heck of a lot of environmental experiences. And I shouldn't say zero because nothing is zero exactly, but just for argument's sake, it's always a combination of both.
Okay, I like the water bottle demonstration in there. I think that helps to visualize. So I do want to squeeze in another question or two. We've got several that have come in that we haven't had a chance to ask yet. Catherine in Port Dover would like to know if the plasticity and changes with the synapses that we were talking about, does that mean that all psychological problems can be resolved from one generation to the next?
One generation, meaning, well, I'm not sure what she means by generation, but I think if you're talking about like genetic memory, that's a very interesting kind of approach to looking at how individuals through the generations could gain from prior generations. There's a phenomenon, I don't know how much detail I want to get into, but there's a phenomenon called epigenetics. I don't know if you've heard that term. You may have heard it in the media, but what that is, and it kind of relates to what Dana was talking about earlier, is what used to be considered nature versus nurture, where nature was something that happened within the gene code itself, within the DNA, and nurture was something that happened through society, through social interaction, through the environment. And the argument was always this kind of distinct category. Did the disease happen through nurture, through experience, through the environment, or did it happen through genetic code, or a combination of the two? But what has happened in the development of neuroscience, again, in our understanding of these elements like synaptic plasticity, is that if there's enough strengthening of a synapse, for example, you can actually incite changes in the genetic material itself. You can, and that used to be thought with the nature-nurture distinction that if it's nature, it's locked in stone. That's your genetic blueprint, nothing's going to change. Well, now with epigenetics, what it means is any kind of experience you may have encountered, and if it's strong enough of an experience, and you get this kind of plasticity and strengthening of synapses, you can actually start to invade into the nucleus of the cell and change the genetic blueprint, this thing that's supposed to be a locked in stone blueprint, and change it how it's going to code for certain proteins, certain systems that are needed for operations, and alter it. Alter the morphology of the cell, alter the characteristics of the cell. And that can actually result in a complete redesign of certain ways of future operations of that cell that may be called upon to operate in a different environmental circumstance. Now the question is, when you start through epigenetics, if you're starting to change the genetic code, does that have a long-lasting impression? Or is that just something that'll slowly go away? Well, initially it was thought, yeah, it'll change, but it's all part and parcel of how the neuron operates at a given moment. And there may be memories, and the changes that are associated with that memories may be around. Does that translate into other generations? There is some talk now that possibly the epigenetic changes, if they're strong enough, could lead to permanent kind of representations in developing embryonic stages of new generations of individuals. So it's a carryover. A lot of this original idea of genetic memory came from animals that actually started with planarian, these little flatworms that remembered how to condition and avoid certain stimuli. The generations, the babies, knew from the parents, from their conditioning experience. So is there a firm up answer? No, but there's some very exciting things about epigenetics and what that means in terms of long-lasting changes that may exist in a subsequent generation.
Well, I'm looking forward to years down the road when I hear about this very exciting research from an up-and-coming researcher from Port Dover, Ontario, in epigenetics and how these changes can span generations. So I'll watch out for that. For now, I have one more question. I know we have to wrap up. I'd like to ask a question from Joyce, who's in grade 8 in a school in Mississauga. She would like to know if we feel depressed or maybe sad, but we don't actually have depression by a clinical definition, how can we prevent ourselves from developing depression?
That's a big, tough question, actually, for a short one. Well, there's a lot of different thoughts about how depression is developed and what kinds of different things contribute to depression. It typically is different for different people. It's tough to prevent certain experiences that might lead you into developing depression because you can't really control what's going on around you all the time, right? It's a tough one. I don't know if I have a clear-cut answer for that. There's different types of cognitive or thinking kind of therapies that we do where we address what we call maladaptive thought patterns. And these are sort of negative, automatic thoughts that pop into our heads when we're feeling down and depressed. And they can happen with people that don't have full-blown clinical depression, but maybe are feeling sad. Especially, you might even notice if you're feeling a little bit down one day, having negative thoughts popping into your head, things like, oh, I'm a failure, or I can't do anything right, or things like that. And it's important to sort of recognize that these are just thoughts and they might not be true. So what we can do is test our thoughts and think about, well, let's say, for example, I'm thinking that I'm a failure, I can't do anything right. I can then sort of sit down and take some time and think about evidence against those negative thoughts that are popping into my head. Thinking about things in the past that I may have done really well. You know, I got a really good grade on a test a few weeks ago, or I made somebody else in my life feel really good when they were feeling down. And getting that evidence against some of the negative thoughts that automatically pop into our heads when we're feeling down can help us to change the thoughts. If we keep doing it sort of for a repeated amount of time, down the road, the negative thoughts tend to eventually turn into more realistic thoughts. And that can help to alleviate depression. Another really good thing that's evidence-based, so based in research, and that's been shown to work with a lot of folks that have things like depression and anxiety, or even symptoms like depression and anxiety, are meditation and what we call mindfulness. So if you want to go onto Google or YouTube and do a quick search for mindfulness and relaxation videos, using those for a little bit of time every day, just taking 5 to 20 minutes every day to just listen to those videos and take some time to yourself to relax, can be really helpful for a lot of people. And I've seen a lot of patients that have found that really helpful over time in terms of improving their mood. So those are the two things that I would say, just kind of in a nutshell, for people feeling blue. But it can be quite tough. It's tough to take preventative measures without actually going in and getting help from, say, a psychologist or a counselor, which is also an option for people. You don't need to have a mental health disorder in order to get counseling help.
That's very good advice. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing insight on what is scientifically going on and symptomatically going on, and what help is out there for anyone who feels that they may need it, diagnoses received or not. And for answering all the questions we had today. Thank you so much for joining us. I think our audience was trying hard today to stump the experts. But next up on Live Event, we're talking about stem cells and cancer research. More information on this and other upcoming webinars is available at pirweb.org. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.